We are live. So welcome to another Headless Creator session on really looking at content management systems and how to evaluate different vendors. And I'm Mark Demany, and I also be pleased and fortunate to have my colleagues Peter Fogelsanger and Tim Benix here. And the reason they're here is, like me, they've worked at a lot of different vendors and also understand a lot of the different criteria. And today we're specifically going to be talking about non-functional criteria. And I guess the real question is looking at this first. The functional criteria we're actually going to look at in another session. We're looking at this first, really because when you're buying software, often it's, especially enterprise software, you're really entering into much more of a relationship than something like a B2C product where you're just buying it and you don't necessarily have a long-term relationship with the vendor. And there's a lot of different things that you're going to be interacting with the vendor on. And so in a lot of ways, non-functional criteria is in some cases even more important than functional criteria. And so that's why we thought we'd cover that first. And there's a number of different topics we're going to talk about. Partner network, geography, community, documentation, reputation. So this may be a long session. This may go over because there are actually a lot of interesting things to discuss. So at that, Peter and Tim, welcome and welcome to the session.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
I think that was a really an appropriate intro from my point of view. Before coming into the MarTech vendor, content management vendor world, I spent about 12 years in the agency side. And throughout that pretty long period of time, I've seen pretty consistently when projects go wrong, it's often the non-functional requirements that maybe are overlooked or not evaluated quite as strongly as the tangible functional things. And that's where a project can go sideways.
Yeah, exactly. I've been on the same trajectory, just not 12 years, but I guess, I don't know, 10 or 11 or something like that. And
what are you saying, Tim?
Oh my God. I'm saying nothing. I'm also old. Anyways, it's not what I wanted to go for, but what we see, and we talked about this last week a little bit, where people at agency level or even on the customer side actually choose a CMS or something in the composable space based on their opinion. Like they've seen some cool video or they've been at a conference where this speaker was great and they're just like, okay, this is cool, I'm going to go for this. But then if you don't look at the non-functional criteria, then suddenly why are your developers complaining that there's no documentation for a certain feature or stuff like that actually just goes wrong in process that you had no idea about when you made that choice. And don't get me wrong, sometimes you're forced to make that choice, especially in the old school times of the DXPs where you're basically bound by your platform. Doing a new greenfield project might still be greenfield, but with the pre-existing contract that you had for 5 million for 10 years. Right. And so these non-functional requirements are actually really hard, and people sometimes have to somehow let go of their egos when choosing something, and it's actually really hard to do that.
Mm-hmm. And I think when you're looking at the non-functional, with the functional requirements, it's somewhat black and white. Do they meet your requirements or not? And they're a little bit easier to know and evaluate. The non-functional there's not necessarily a right and a wrong or a black and white. Do they meet my requirements or not? But it's important, I think, for brands to understand the impact of those non-functional criteria and be going into a project with their eyes open. So that if you run into issues or you need some support, you've thought about it ahead of time and you know what your contingency plans are.
Yeah, because there's actually quite a few CMSs that I know that don't offer professional services or solution engineering. Right. And you might need that because you have a very complicated work to do. And then others are much more in the cool kids space where they are on every conference and they sponsor everything and you can get swag and you become an ambassador. And so I think it's really context based what you choose for each project to make this work, because you might have this all-star developer that you rely on. They probably want something fancy where they can go to conferences and talk about that tech, and not choose one that's a little bit more stuffy, but that might be amazing. Right? So you have to really choose in this specific way based on what your team is made up of and who your partners might be. But I will not go too far with this because we have a community tab below in our agenda.
That's an excellent point, Tim. And I was pulling the slide back up really to talk about onboarding. We touched upon it a little bit. And I think this is one of those things. That, in my opinion, really key is onboarding. Really, how quickly can you understand the software? How quickly can you get access to the software? And I know, Tim and I are kind of a little bit more of the developer bent, where we like vendors that provide, free instances. You can start to just learn for yourself. And there are other approaches to that. And I think it's important to discuss when looking at onboarding, what exactly does that onboarding experience look like, and why do vendors have different models?
So I know Peter comes from a different school of thought here. So maybe let's start with you, Peter.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And so I guess I have two trains of thought on this topic. There's a lot of software vendors who have been very deliberate in not having, the free or the community or the downloadable version of their software. And sometimes they may make that decision because it's enterprise software that is maybe more complex than an individual should be evaluating by themselves. So they want to curate that evaluation. Or it could be there's so many different audiences. I think, if you think about content management, at the end of the day, there's several audiences that will be using a CMS vendor, CMS software. And so simply to be evaluated by the developer who pulls it down and looks at APIs in a kind of blank slate way might be misleading. Like you said, forget how you characterized it, Tim, the hot developer or the hotshot developer, however you characterized it. That role might be really enamored with the product-led, downloadable, or self-service evaluation, and they may completely overlook the editorial experience or the marketer experience or the integrations with the rest of the stack that they don't care about. So I think my train of thought on this topic would be, if you're evaluating headless CMSs, you need to make sure every party is at the table, and don't let a particular approach or one particular audience heavily weight your success criteria.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important point. And certainly we cover this in the guide. And actually that reminds me, if you haven't you should go and download the CMS Comparison guide, because everything that we're talking about conceptually is in this giant document. So you have that for reference. But that is really one of the key things, is, to Peter's point, make sure that you're involving your stakeholders. And, as I said, Tim and I, often we were coming from, when we were looking at CMS software for evaluation, we were coming from it from the developer end. There's certain things that we prefer. But to Peter's point, understanding all of your stakeholders is really important. And depending upon the scope of your project, you may have a number of different stakeholders. In the guide, I think we've identified 7 different types of stakeholders, and then even within those, you may have or exceptions to those stakeholders. You may have power users, you may have external people, and depending upon what you're trying to do, those are important. So yeah, definitely think about your stakeholders. And I think for us, certainly, usually, especially when you're looking at composable and headless systems, usually it is a little bit more of a developer driven process. And that's certainly, I think, why a lot of vendors have leaned into that. So you will see very commonly that, to Tim's point, you can get free access to software, you can test it yourself, you can look at the documentation. And I think that's an intentional choice on behalf of those vendors to try to get mind share within that community and seed developers so that then when those developers are working with enterprises, that's often the first choice on their mind.
And the reality is that Headless has been a developer-driven architecture. It was really
You just made my point. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So you can't overlook that. That's a really important part of the evaluation. If you're thinking about Composable and Headless, but it's not all of it. It's not all.
No, there's obviously more, but there's also other sides to this story where sometimes, and this is more of a personal opinion I'm thinking here for me, where if you choose, let's say we're talking about like Headless CMS, it should be a very simple thing, right? It's amazing at content modeling. You get an amazing form to be able to fill out your data. You have roles with rules and regulations, and you have workflows. And if it's that simple, you should be able to just open it up and have everybody try, because we'll talk about later, community and marketing, what that does for that. But initially, I think if your tool is very simple and it should do exactly what it said on the tin, it should be able to be open because it's very easy to evaluate. And what you start to see now within this composable headless space, that there are much more modern software approaches to building a product than others, where for some of these CMSs, it takes you 2 weeks to actually set up a sandbox, which means they probably started 8 years ago by building this using certain tech. And if you go with the more modern CMS that was built last year, it's all cloud native, where there's no concept of making a new instance for you. Right. So there's also technical things that you can pick up based on that. And I think the more complex a system gets, the more fragmented it is. Sometimes it's amazing for your use case, right? Let's have a quick example that's actually very positive here. Amplience. They have a really wide range of amazing things they do. It's quite logical that if you go in there as a developer, that you're relatively junior, you just want to check it out, you're not going to see the breadth of awesome that you get here. So for them, it makes total sense. But when you go to another CMS that's less feature rich, but equally amazing, you might not need that. And then the self-service will get you really far, because then maybe this developer that tries it out sells it to their boss. And that's just another marketing funnel, but that's for later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think those are excellent points. And I think we could probably spend a lot more time talking about onboarding and some of those aspects when we talk onboarding and some of those aspects when we talk about apps. But I think it probably makes sense to move things along a little bit and talk about partner network. And this is really why we brought Peter along. Peter helps run partner enablement and a number of other enablement functions here at Uniform, and he's done that at a number of different vendors. And so of all the people I know, Peter is probably one of the most, is why we dragged him along to this session. So Peter, if you'd like to kick that off.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, and I think it's easy with Composable and Headless to forget that there's really two key types of partnerships that you want to be thinking about when you're evaluating your choices. One is what probably comes top of mind is, your implementation, your agency resources, and I'll come back to that in a second. But it's equally important to evaluate who they have integrations and partnerships with in the rest of the stack, and not simply just a paper, check the box. They've got an integration with my favorite DAM or my favorite CDN. That's an area I think Composable and Headless can really projects can get into trouble, and where your functional audiences have got to play a part in your process, where you think about your use cases for how you want your CMS to work with that other system, and then look at the integration. Does the integration support that kind of use case? And it's going to take a little bit longer to evaluate that than you might like. But again, you're buying into Headless and Composable because of the openness and the plug and play capability. You don't want to paint yourself in a corner by picking tech that doesn't work well together. But maybe it's not productized. That's another question to ask. Ask the vendor, like, hey, you've got this integration with this other vendor. What's the roadmap look like? How often do you update it? What's the support for that integration? And there's all kinds of rabbit holes that you could get yourself caught in just on the technology partnership side. And Tim, I know you've got some strong opinions and experience in that topic too.
Yeah, that's another angle to it. Like sometimes when you choose a technology, you might also have chosen your agency, or maybe you are the agency, and then there's other factors in play. And as an agency, there are different types of agencies, right? Some agencies are much more platform driven, and what they do is they say, this is a really nice combination of like 4 tools, and they might have a list of 5 combinations that they always use. Those agencies tend to not have a very full bench of developers, because they can always put these people on these same types of projects, which is really good. And that means they make good money, and they're excellent to be partners with. Because if they like your tool, they'll put that in every project, which is exactly what you want if you are a Headless CMS, but also when you chose that CMS with that partner, because they'll be talking together about roadmaps, support, all that stuff. However, there's also other types of different agencies that are much more value first, where every time they might just choose one specific problem to fix for a certain customer, and that's not replicable to the next project or to another one. And of course, the CMS kind of fits in a lot of those things. But let's say when they're campaign-driven things, like for Nike or something, you might not need that one CMS that you partner with every time, and then the agency cannot fulfill their partnerships, whatever agreements you discussed. Because of course, when you're partners with an agency as a CMS, you might want to get some deals with them, or you want to have an amazing discourse with one person that's always there that tells you about upcoming trends or whatever, right? And so know what agency you're dealing with, and know if that CMS fits in that type of work that they do. And so, again, that's all non-functional, right? But it's really important to know whom you have chosen to work with.
Yeah, and I'll pile on there, Tim. I think we've all probably been around projects where the brand, fast forward several years from when they selected the tech and selected the agency, and they'll often be looking at doing, a replatforming or transformation, not because they made a bad choice on the tech, but maybe because they feel like they've got locked in to, the implementation, the way the implementation was done, and by whom.
Yeah.
And your best agency relationships, service provider relationships, are when they're delivering value and you're retaining them by choice, not because
That's the best. 100%.
they've got you handcuffed. And so when I think it's really important, even if you're not hiring an agency out of the gate to implement your CMS, I think it's really important to look at the ecosystem of service providers, because you don't know what you're going to need in a year or 2 years or 3 years. Your hot developer, your Tim Bennix, maybe moves on to another company, and now the guy who did all that great work is gone. Are you left high and dry without anybody to support your stack?
Oh, that's such a good point that I've had to deal with as a technology leader at agencies, even where we just lose one of our developers, and all that knowledge is connected inside that little team. And you also saw sometimes, so we built the greenfield thing. Now that it became brownfield, we'll just give it to this other agency to maintain. That's a messy situation. And so this is one thing, if I could give a bit of friendly advice to people choosing a CMS and an agency: know about what you're choosing yourself. Understand, almost hire the product owner that understands this stuff to be in your company. Don't rely on other agencies or CMS vendors to just say, we'll just give you $5,000 a day professional services for a year. And then suddenly that stops, right? Okay, this is a little bit of friendly advice from Uncle Tim that doesn't fit this stream, but I've seen that firsthand, and you really need to start looking at owning the stakeholder that understands why you have chosen Composable. The hurdle is bigger to start, but once you have it, it's just smooth sailing. That's really important.
I think this, along that same parallel, when you're evaluating the software vendors, you can get a lot of insight into the DNA of the company by how they respond to you about your need for service providers. If it's, well, let's get the deal done first and then or it's, oh, here's our website, go pick yourself. If it's kind of that little bit of a hands-off approach to helping you implement the software they're selling you, then that tells you a lot about their motivation to make sure you're successful. And if they can't be a partner and help you evaluate a short list, ideally they give you 3 recommendations that they're really comfortable with. And there's very clear reasons they made those recommendations. And it's not just, these are the 3 partners who bring us the deals most frequently. It should be, these are the 3 most qualified for your kind of project in your kind of geography or industry or whatever. And then they'll stand behind it. They're certified or whatever.
This is why we put so much emphasis on this at Uniform. It's really important to have good solution engineering, real strong enablement, a port of all that. Sorry, I'm just pitching you, Peter, but here we go.
Well, you're right. I think it's also worth pointing out, this is really expensive to do, right? From the vendor side. And to Peter's point, this is why it's kind of worth sussing out, because that also reveals a lot of priorities from the vendor perspective. It's expensive to run a partner program. It's expensive to do enablement. It's expensive to understand what those relationships are and who's good at what. And there's a lot of that corporate knowledge that takes a lot of time to actually build up.
But I think the reality is that this might not be a topic that everyone listening to this stream thinks is that important if they have in-house resources. But it all ties together with onboarding and then the ecosystem of resources that are available to you in that vendor's ecosystem. Because the ironic thing about Headless and Composable is you can get some amazing technology and build a really crappy project really fast and get yourself into a lot of trouble. And we've all been around projects where there's this amazing content modeling capability, and somebody decides to build the big WordPress-like, rich text field centric content model that you can't reuse that content anywhere because it's one big fat field
that's what we like to call the Mac monolith. You can no longer point a finger at something that was built to behave like a monolith, but it's actually compiled of like 17 different sources. There's no finger pointing. There's no professional services. None of it.
Oh, there's finger pointing. You got to point the finger.
There will be, but finger pointing will be deflected.
That's right.
So let's see, what else do we have? Maybe
I think
geography.
Geographic footprint.
Well, maybe if we talk geographical footprint, do we maybe discuss culture first rather than where offices are?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's probably, in post-COVID, those are probably more nuanced reasons for picking geography than physical location is. Yeah,
it's also just how people behave and how they think, okay, what is actually polite business? And how are the decisions being made? Like, for example, I live now in France, which is more Southern Europe style, where you might have a whole discussion with 20 people. But then the 2 leaders from both parties, or 3 leaders, go and have a coffee after the meeting and actually decide and not tell the others. That's relatively normal.
Interesting.
And so the way people trust each other is also very different. Like when you are, let's say, in Germany or more Nordic or more, even in the US, you come with a set of credentials. You have done certain things, and based on that, the trust is just there.
Yeah.
But then when you're in other parts of the world, that trust is only there when it's not like from working together and having credentials. It's because you went to high school together, because I know you for 20 years. That's where the trust is. And so you need to work together for many years to be able to just say something even that people listen to. And so if you do business between these different cultures, you really need to understand how people are pitching, persuading, explaining, all of that. I can talk about that for an hour if you want to, maybe not today.
I think that's really good insight, Tim. And the last 10 or 12 years of my career, I've worked for software vendors that are just bridging the Europe versus North American business community. And if you've not experienced that directly, you might not realize how different the business markets work just based upon European kind of practices versus North American practices. And I've seen firsthand where when it's not well understood, the things that happen on a day-to-day basis between the two different teams gets conflict. It raises conflict because you think that certain things should happen a certain way. I'll give you an example. Europeans often don't appreciate how big the United States is geographically.
Clearly, yes.
And I've had leaders in past roles that will say, well, just go camp out at their office and go meet that prospect or meet that customer, meet that partner. And they don't realize they're suggesting you get on a 5-hour plane ride to go from the East Coast to the West Coast to sit outside somebody's office to try to hijack them to have the meeting that wasn't scheduled. Like, it's not like you're sitting in London and you can just hop on the tube and, go grab a pint at the end of the day with somebody.
It's a very different story. Like where I'm from, you can travel 4 countries in one day easy.
Yeah, you can travel 4 states in many parts of the U.S. in a day.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's definitely things like that. I mean, that's kind of the logistic difference, but there's all kinds of subtle. For me, a very interesting one that I've seen a few times is where the way you pitch something like an idea, for example, where a lot of countries, it's based on how you were taught in school. So in a lot of countries, what you learn in school is you learn all the how do you call this? Like you read the book, you understand all the things, and then you practice. But then more in the US and more in the Netherlands where I'm from, more from the north, you practice while you learn. And at one point you end up in the same place. But turns out people actually try to convince you or sell you something with that in mind. So if you have to sit through somebody from France pitching in the US, they will give you 45 minutes of background and then maybe 5 of let's do this. Right.
Where if you're an American going to France, you would sell it with, I know this. This is the best thing. Do you have a question? And then you'll see that the French people will ask you 45 minutes of questions. And that is such a different thing. And there's many, many nuances there where I was working at an English company where I had to pitch to Germans. So what English people do is they would do a little funny, degrading joke about themselves and then have an amazing pitch, like the best you've ever seen. But when you're a German person, you will give them your credentials, where you studied, all the things you know, and then give an amazing presentation. Imagining an English person then pitching to a German by doing something degrading. In the first minute, the Germans are out.
You disqualify.
Oh, yes, but this guy didn't prepare. Okay, bye. I don't care anymore. If you don't know these things, business will be lost. I've seen business lose a lot based on these small things.
And for a customer evaluating an agency that doesn't quite appreciate the culture of where that agency's resources are coming from, and imagine 6 months from now when you're in the middle of the statement of work and you don't understand why there's this friction or why they keep getting deliverables wrong, it's because you didn't understand their cultural, their way of evaluating, the way of prioritizing is very different than yours.
Exactly.
And that's okay if you make that choice consciously.
Once you know, it's cool because then you can use their powers. Like I've had it so often where they would almost like farm out a lot of the development work to, let's say, a company in India, right? Because it's cheaper. That's the idea. But then not realizing their strength. And their strength is being extremely agile, super fast, figuring things out day to day. Where if you go to the US, people are much more high, long thinkers, where they really plan all the milestones and know every little detail because they thought very long and hard about something. Well, if you swap these two things around, where you have people from India that are agile by default, trying to do long haul projects with a lot of thinking involved, they might have multiple people in the team that all do that slightly differently. And then you get sort of a patchwork of work. Of product, where in the US people get really annoyed when they cannot actually give their opinion and think properly and take a while.
Right.
And I'm not saying people are working slowly in the US, it's just different vibes. So know whom you're talking to and what their strengths are.
So I guess the next thing about geographical that we wanted to maybe hit on a little bit is just where they operate, their data center support, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely worth discussing. I know certainly vendors have different data centers and are using different CDNs, and they focus on that on the content delivery side, and some of that is performance related, but some vendors in particular are doing that for data retention reasons. Particularly in Europe, there's a lot of legislation around certain countries being able to store certain data in other countries, and depending upon the level of compliance or what you need to do for that market, you may really that may be a supremely important criteria for you. Whereas if you're in the US, that aside from the performance aspect, the legal aspect may not be important at all.
Well, look at the Threads application from Meta. That's not going to come out in Europe anytime soon. Probably never, depending on whatever they want to know from you. And it's just, but we've had customers before the whole Russia-Ukraine thing happened that were still operating in Russia, and they needed to have special servers there to be able to have their personal data there because it wasn't allowed to be stored elsewhere. And so suddenly, things like multi-CDN for a vendor becomes really important. Right? How do you deal with the China issue? Do you have 20 CDNs that somehow cover all of China, or do you have something on the ground there? How much does it cost? What's your SLA for things? Yeah, I feel like this stream is just making sure that people realize how complicated this all is.
Yeah, exactly. And again, I think the theme here is, you have to evaluate these things for what your current requirements are, but also be aware of what your options are for future requirements. Yeah. You might only need a North American data center now, but what happens if, the East Coast internet gets hit by a power outage or something? Do you have a fallback?
Yeah, actually, another fun example that I just remembered just now, a lot of e-commerce companies won't use a vendor that uses Amazon for their underlying infrastructure because Amazon is their number one competitor.
Right. Crazy.
Yeah. That one was very, very interesting. I was at one vendor, and that fact alone scuttled deals. So
and then they have to struggle with Google Cloud. Oh my God.
or Azure or
yeah, of course. I'm just kidding.
Yeah. But yeah, no, it's a factor, right? So, and it is kind of funny because it's one of those things that you would think would be very low on your priority list, but for these clients that were in a retail space, that was literally a deal breaker. So, again, to Tim's point, know what your deal breakers are, right?
Let's talk community, because that's a really interesting one, right? So let me just ask you, Peter, in where you have worked before Uniform, did community matter a lot for either the vendor or maybe at the agency where you were?
Well, in my last couple of roles, it has come up quite often in evaluations, and I think some vendors use that as a competitive differentiator. It's like, hey, we have a community, and the other vendor you're evaluating doesn't. I think brands looking at composable tech have to decide how important that is. If it's a real tech-heavy product and a tech-heavy implementation, then yeah, you might need a rich Discord community for your developers to talk to other developers. If it's MarTech modernization and that vendor is only one of 6 in your stack, then maybe that community is not quite as important because it's your whole stack that's going to be somewhat unique. And then, your agency ecosystem is probably a lot more important than, a developer community. So, again, I think the answer is it depends.
It always is. Like, you might be surprised from my answer here, but I completely agree. And I think for agencies choosing a CMS vendor or any composable vendor, I think the community means almost nothing. When we're talking about Discord and Slack communities or Twitter, stuff like that, I think it's essentially not interesting because it's just headless people in the tech space talking to other headless people in the tech space and don't agree with each other. That's generally what this is.
That's right.
So, of course, there are different aspects to this. Like, if you want to evaluate a vendor, and you are super tech heavy, maybe it's interesting. But if you have all these roles, like you said in the beginning, Peter, maybe that will only cater for 1 out of 8 roles. Maybe it's not that important. However, when you are a CMS or a product in this space, having a community is actually huge, because what it can do is it will be an bottom up funnel into sales, because you can, from a community, from people that use your product and like it or have questions, you can actually grow awareness about your product. How fast do you reply? Does everybody understand what you're doing? You can actually then start to say, hey, you're a rock star in our community, and you are one, and you are one, and then you make an ambassadors program. And what that does for you, if you do it right, I haven't seen it done right many times, but if you do, then suddenly these ambassadors say, okay, so I get a bit of swag from this company, like, uniform hat. They might send me out to a conference where I can speak. And then what you can do as a strategy is having them name drop you, or maybe even do a piece of content about you as a product, or combine it with an agency. Maybe you have a rock star at an agency that loves your product, and they speak to other customers in pitches about how they used you. What that means is this is literally free marketing, free perception building, if it's orchestrated well. So if you give back a little bit to these people and they start to speak to communities, that's the long-term game of getting bottom-up
And
sales.
the really hard thing about communities, it always sounds like just this great idea, let's share best practices and whatnot. The reality is you've got two big audiences there. You've got the customers who may not want to share their questions in a public
They
forum.
generally don't.
And then you've got the agencies who are like, well, I don't want to share with my competitor what I do or don't know about this headless CMS. So you've got these two groups that probably could contribute really good questions and propose really good best practices and answers, who just won't participate because it's public. So it's a hard
but then
thing.
it's really about developers, because this is the one thing. Developers have a double life. If they work in an agency, they're generally upset because they have to do something they didn't choose to do, but it's still cool somehow. And then their other life is, I'm on Twitter making sure that this dumpster fire becomes more fiery, and there's this amazing opinion I have about React, which is all fine because we move our community forward by talking about amazing things. And I am in the Vue community, and it's the best thing to be in. Everybody's super supportive. You learn a lot from each other. Right. And so all these people also work at agencies, but these community events don't exactly talk about their day-to-day work. It's more opinion-based about certain tech and how an API works with a certain CMS or whatever. Yeah. And so it's relatively safe. It can be dumpster fiery, but you won't find in the communities I talk about, the Discord ones and the Slack ones, you won't find agencies and customers.
Right.
Because exactly, they don't want to share. So you have to rely on your developers to be sane in the head and not share IP, but still chat.
Right. And I think my advice to brands that are evaluating headless tech would be to explore what does the vendor provide through their support mechanisms that is private, or only available for customers, and evaluate what's there. How do they manage things like tickets and knowledge bases and provide that information to you once you're a paying customer? That's a little bit different than a public Discord or Slack community.
Totally. Exactly. And what you see quite a lot with companies that are a little bit more in the enterprise space is that they do have people to work in the community or to developer relations or things like that. And in a space where it's more sales-led growth and a little bit more enterprise, they just become first level support when people have some question and they're upset. And I've had it quite often where we saw, when I worked a lot with Sitecore, for example, that these poor DevRel people were just first line of shouting. And they were just the shit filters to what actually went into the real agencies that would help them out, right? And it is a different approach to things. And I think that, like, again, saying something about Sitecore, they have done this extremely well.
Agreed. Yeah.
Right. It's basically the best ambassadors program I've ever seen, and everybody really wants to be one.
That goes back to what we were talking about earlier: is how much does the vendor invest and facilitate that ecosystem? if they're serious about it, there will be a formal certification, credentialing, MVP, ambassador, something like that, that incents professional developers to participate and grow their knowledge and share their knowledge. And
generally what CMSs want is just people to make content about them, because it's really hard to make content.
Yeah.
It's just crazy hard to do that.
Not just that, it also helps people understand what's possible. I think, one of the things certainly on the vendor side that's interesting is we sort of build something and think, oh, people will use it for X. And in fact, a lot of agencies and developers will go and say like, oh, I can use this crazy tech and do some other thing. Tim, you were giving some example of a few agencies that have taken Uniform and kind of gone in a different direction than we initially thought of when we were designing the software. And I think the community is great for that, because you see that again and again and again.
Yeah, that's the developer brain there. They took it into a magical direction. And then when I showed them how we intended it, it was like, oh. And so I was like, why did you do that? Because of reasons. Because we can. Yeah. We are developers. We go in every direction, because why not? Right? There are such different brains in our space. Like in our document, right? We have 7 shareholders or stakeholders, I think, in this. And developers are only just one. And somehow in this headless space, we keep talking about them. They're not the essential people to make something a success. It's really a team buy. Everybody needs to understand where all these puzzle pieces go. Because this is the one thing I made a video yesterday about content editors. When they hit publish anywhere, they don't know what happens. Isn't that's pretty crazy, right? Yeah. We need to find a fix for that stuff.
Well, and not to plug Uniform, but you guys know I've been really excited about some of the capabilities that have been released recently, not because it helps a developer, but it helps another whole audience in the Composable project, the information architect or the content modeler, having some amazing tools that they can do things really, really fast, but in a very enterprise way, to do things like configuring new data sources or creating what we call patterns. So, having technology, having the vendors invest in areas for those other audiences, not just the back-end developer, full stack developer, or front-end developer. There's all these other roles on digital transformation projects that are important.
Exactly.
Campaign manager. What's the vendor providing to that role and that audience?
All right, let's see. I think we talked a lot about community. We've got about 15 minutes left. I want to talk a little bit about documentation. And I think one of the interesting things about documentation is the fact that it's generally speaking, certainly for newer composable vendors, much more open than it used to be. Back in the day, documentation used to be very gated. You could only look at it if you were a customer.
I've never understood that, by the way.
Yeah, I've never understood it as well. To me, I've said this a number of times. I think of documentation as product marketing, essentially. I think that's one of those things that you really should be releasing out to the world. And on that note, I think it's one of those things that you can actually look at and learn a lot about different vendors by looking at documentation. So kind of to kick off this conversation, I thought we'd go and look at a few representative examples of vendors and look at how they provide their documentation, which in turn provides a little bit of a window about how they see themselves. So
I think before we dive into that, I'd love to give one nuance to this to keep in mind while we look at these documentations, is that when you're in a composable space, you are in the hardest position to make good documentation out of all spaces, in my opinion. Because first, explain your product. Second, make a glossary about all the terms that you use. Third, explain concepts of headless that for people that don't understand any of that stuff. And then third, show examples that can go in any direction and probably people won't even use them that way. And then fifth, I think, actually document your APIs and SDKs. Anyways, I just wanted to say this is a 7-tiered problem. Yeah. If you're just React, you have a 2-tiered problem. Concepts, show the API, done. I'm not saying that's easy to write. It's actually incredibly hard because they have millions of users. But for a composable company, it might be the hardest thing to do is documentation, not even building the product. Sorry, I just wanted to give that nuance.
And then if you do that really, really well, all your competitors are plagiarizing it.
Yes,
So
but it will be Google SEO and it will lead to sales.
Yeah, no, I think that's
copy-paste.
Yeah, that's super relevant. And, I'm going to show a few examples here. We're going to look at Contentful and Content Stack and Storyblock. And I think all three of them have good documentation. So this isn't kind of a comparison of quality. It's really just a comparison of approach. And, as we look through some of these, I think we can kind of touch on some of the concepts Tim talked about, because I think those are really important to understand. You'll often see and we'll look at Contentful first here. You'll often see something that's like a resource center. So these are sort of high level, more product marketing things, white papers, ebooks, blogs, customer case studies, etc. Now, for their documentation itself, interestingly enough, it's very developer leaning. So you'll see, developer portal and documentation. We'll contrast that with, say, Storyblock, for example. If you're looking at their resources, you'll see developer guides, developer tutorials, and content editor guides. And I think this is a nice example to see, like, okay, they do see these personas a little bit more equal. And so, we talked about all these different stakeholders. And, I think part of the challenge for developers is how to effectively target content to different stakeholders. Obviously, we talk about 7 in our guide. You're not going to have 7 sets of documentation on your site. That's not really realistic. But for them, it is an exercise in saying, okay, how do we kind of segment this to an extent that does make sense to people? So that's certainly an example there. Part of it as well is tutorials within that. I think this is Storyblock, at least here, has a good example. So, you talk about the use case, you have example code that helps you work through those things. Having pictures is nice. Having videos is nice as well. And this is really what you're looking at when you're looking at the documentation is, do I have documentation for those personas that I am really trying to target my implementation to, and does that documentation help them achieve what they're trying to achieve? And I think this is a really nice example here.
Yeah, what's really good about Storyblock is I know them a little bit. I know a few people that work there, and they have a whole team called DX, Developer Experience, and they are in charge of doing developer relations, community documentation, and the website. And they have so much budget allocated. It's literally their day job to make this documentation with like 12 people.
Nice.
Yeah.
So they're constantly on this thing. This is basically, they recently got a lot of money from a great investment. And other than jumping into the enterprise space and doing all the conferences, this is a huge impact for them, where they actually spend a lot of that cash with like an excellent team to make this and maintain it. And of course, the product did great updates. I've used it a lot, actually. But this is an equally important part, which is, I can imagine, not the same in other vendors.
Yeah. And honestly, I didn't have a conversation with Tim up front when I was picking these examples. I just kind of picked ones that I knew.
I'm happily surprised to see this one.
Did a good job. Yeah. And well, there's certain other things that I think, vendors do better than others, but I think Storyblock from a documentation point of view does a very good job, and especially balancing those personas as well. So, we're looking at developer examples, but then certainly content editor guides, having nice infographics. We talked, Tim, you were talking about one of the struggles, particularly with Headless, is explaining concepts. And, even before you just get into the APIs, like conceptually, how do we work and what's our view of the world? And, this is a great example here. Okay. So you've got this admin interface and everything works through this API. And then your, different content sources are reading from that API, and how your custom interactions interact. Like, yeah, this is a high quality graphic. certainly explanation of the user interface. This is a high quality graphic. You've got a video walkthrough. Like, this is a nice example of good documentation.
I know that video, by the way. It's 40 minutes. It's a little intense, but at least it's there.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's a good example there. Let's actually switch.
What I like about that example is it meets the audience where they're coming from.
Yeah,
because there's what I think some headless vendors have underappreciated is there's a lot of different types of user of learning styles, and some people learn visually, some people learn through audio processing, some people like to just read. And so this introduction example hits all three of those learning styles. If you're the person who's going to prefer reading the reference and just kind of ticking off the reference, you can get it. If you're visual and you want to just look at the diagram and kind of have the concepts in diagram, you get it. If you need a walkthrough because you're really novice, you've got the video, and that's expensive. But if they're serious about helping make sure their prospective customers understand these concepts, they have to make that investment.
And let's see, we are coming up on the hour, but I really quickly just want to go to Contentful. I mean, in a way, this is also an example of a vendor meeting their audience, and I think they look at their audience, and this is again me saying documentation is a good way of understanding how a company perceives themselves, and they look at their audience as developers. And so if you go to documentation, you'll see all of this documentation is extremely developer focused, and you really have to kind of look through, and it's buried a few levels deep before you actually even get to content editing itself. It's really more.
I wanted to say that, like, searching in their docs, you find a lot, but there's almost too many trees to see the forest.
Yeah, exactly. So I think they, from, again, me sort of perceiving externally, they're looking at it as people already know conceptually what Headless CMS is, and let's just jump right into how our Headless CMS works and the core concepts for Contentful in particular. And again, I think it's good documentation, but it's very different than what we were seeing from Storyblok. So,
but as a result, their developers love their product.
Oh yeah, people love this product. Yeah. I do as well. Like, their APIs are unmatched. So good.
Yeah, exactly. So that's really the point of this. Two very different, polar extremes on how they approach documentation, and they're both good but different. Right. So in the last 5 minutes, and maybe that's good that we've left this to the end, and maybe we'll go over, because this is probably the most contentious one to talk about. Vendor reputation.
Isn't that, like, this is what I want to know. For vendor reputation, is that a long-term game, and what influences it? Is it like just marketing and campaigns, or is it developer relations? Is it big ass customers? Is it use cases? Is it like there's so much here?
Analyst relations?
Oh yeah, we didn't even talk about analyst relations yet. I'm such a developer that my mind doesn't go there very fast. But that does mean a thing. Like, this is interesting, right? When I was at the agency and I wasn't the leader yet, I was just a developer. They were always talking about analyst relations. And to me, as a developer, I was like, but have these people built something with this CMS? Not realizing that they're actually these high thinkers that are influencing a space, right? It's a very different thing. But as developers, you don't care as much. But when you step up one more and you have more overview of what you get to choose when and how and what partners, all the things we just discussed, actually these analyst relations are huge. It's very important to think about.
Yeah.
I just wanted to give that nuance, because if somebody's a developer watching this, like, I don't care about analysts, actually you should. More than you think.
I think that's one of the points is, with analyst relations, they are looking at a lot of stuff very holistically. And, to the point of this conversation, yes, the product is a part of it, but a lot of that non-functional criteria and, what customers are saying and what case studies they have, and, talking to agencies that are implementing it, they're looking at things from a number of different angles. And so, I think certainly analyst reports are one good source of information and intel. Forrester and Gartner in particular, when looking at vendors. I think one of the things, though, that again, when you are looking at those analyst reports, is unless you have an account yourself, usually what will happen is a vendor
leaks it.
well, or a vendor purchases reprint rights, and so they say, hey, we ranked particularly well. Right. You can download the report from our website. In some cases, it will be the full report. In other cases, it will just talk about that vendor, which I think is interesting in that you're not
there's
getting
money involved.
the complete
that makes
picture. Yes,
a little complicated for me. Where between in this room here, we know a lot about our space. We basically know, I don't know, 95% of the important players, even people that work there, right? And then you see an analyst report and something pops up that we don't know. Then we just okay, either we don't know them, or they paid a whole lot of money to somehow wiggle themselves in. And this is where sometimes this gets complicated. But on the other hand, if there are known players on this graph, and every few quarters when somebody leaks that graph and the dot changes, that's a real perception changer.
Yeah, it certainly affects perception. I think my perspective is take it with a grain of salt, right? And even I did a CMS comparison for Uniform, and even that I think the approach is take it with a grain of salt, because
you have to, different contexts, right?
Yeah, yes. Exactly. Different vendors will have different capabilities, and in some cases that will suit you, and in other cases it won't. And so I think, again, the important thing is to take a look at that, go one level deeper and say, okay, are they talking about things that are important to what I'm trying to achieve? And if that's the case, then yes, rank that opinion highly. If they're talking about things that are less important to you, then, don't just look at the graph and what those results are. I think a lot of people end up just saying, okay, we're going to buy the leader, and it's not a good fit for their use case. So, so all that to say, yes, reputation is important. Analysts are a good source of understanding that reputation, but don't just buy on that.
Yeah, I think that's the key, Mark. I would say reputation is really important to evaluate, but don't base it on one source or even one type of source. Don't base it just on 3 analyst reports. Look at what's the peer reviews? What do employees say on Glassdoor about that vendor? Is what they say publicly different than what the way they actually operate? Talk to partners. Go out. Don't even ask them. Go out and find some partners, on websites, and say, hey, what do you think of these guys? Well, and then when you get late stage, I think every evaluation should have at least one really strong reference check, and most of the time, reference checks are not done terribly well. You go to the vendor and say, I'm going to check references, and they come back with one phone number. Of course, they're going to pick a great reference. That's silly for them to give you a reference that wouldn't be ideal. What I would propose is, you ask them to give you a list of potential references that are similar to your requirements. And then you kind of evaluate them in a dialogue with the vendor. Like, okay, tell me about this one. Why did you pick that? Tell me about this one. Why'd you pick them? And then you decide
such a different approach.
And then you decide who you want to talk to, and then you go validate everything from that one. And think about it from your own perspective as a customer. If you want to talk to 3 reference customers, then you have to be willing to be a reference customer in exchange. Because one of the things software vendors really struggle with is every prospective customer wants to talk to references, but then they'll never be a reference. How does that formula doesn't work? So there has to be some give and take there on both parties. Cutting out again.
Tim, yeah, we're losing your audio again.
I'm back. This is why I like the self-service approach, because you can actually just try something and then you don't need these references, because that's really hard. And this goes back to what I was saying in the intro. You have to have a lot more knowledge about what you need internally when you start evaluating this. You need somebody with knowledge from the space to help you to choose, this solves my problem. Because you can go to any reference that you want and they can say, they solved our problem like this, but that's never your problem. And so to me,
But I
I'm
think
much more of
the
a developer,
self-service
I
is-
guess.
I think the self-service is way more complicated than it is from your point of view, because you're thinking
Yeah, for
about,
me, it's normal. I read and write with this stuff, right?
but if you're driving an evaluation for a brand that has 15 different websites with all these content authors and this whole stack, how do you do self-service for all those different audiences to evaluate?
No, you cannot. That's a big project. I know.
So I think the parallel there is some kind of real prototype. Like if you're shortlisted down to one or two, then your final step should be let's prototype something that's similar to one content type, one integration, one or two pages. Like, what's it really going to look like?
This is why I like selling these discovery phases at agencies. Because back in the day, people didn't want to pay for that. But that's kind of weird. You should actually pay for like a 3-month discovery phase where you actually all go hand in hand and you say, this is our problem. How do we solve it? Let's just look at vendors together.
Right.
It's so much more important to have a trusted agency relationship and then choose your vendors. And you know what's even better? And I know we're over the hour, so I'm going to make the point now. Use Uniform, because then you can choose those vendors a lot later. Mm-hmm. You can do much more in parallel. And so maybe with that bombshell,
I was just going to say, and similarly, Tim and I, we talked about this last Thursday and about, you know, that proof of concept phase and that being more and more important. I think, you know, as you're building, you learn more as you're going, and that effort of doing that POC isn't wasted effort. You know, all of that is applicable. And
conversely, if the vendor you're evaluating is unwilling to support some kind of prototype or POC, that's a red flag.
Yeah, that happens too often, in my opinion.
Yeah,
I can name a few ones, but I won't.
Peter, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you guys. This was fun.
Know, Tim and I have a couple more of these, and maybe we'll drag you along for some more of these as well. You're a great guest. Tim, you're always a great co-host. That was
thank you.
Fantastic. All right, at that, thank you, and see you in a couple more days.
Cheers, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.